Oh, I see the problem. I'm gonna leave. Got it. We're being live streamed. Okay. I'm going to leave. The other Pinchas Adler is gonna leave. I hope that nobody minds. Nobody's gonna be upset at him, right? We're not gonna be. Where did he go? Right? Okay. So it's good to see you all here tonight. Thank you for coming for this class on Hanukkah. And the first thing I'm going to do is, as I always say, sharing is caring. So I'm just going to go into my Facebook and share it to my other sections. And of course, I also always start with a joke. So while I do that, I'm going to start with a joke. And this is a very old joke, but it will very much be connected with our class today. And the joke goes like this. Antiochus shows up to a crystal ball reader, and he asks, what day will I die? And the crystal ball reader says, you're going to die on a Jewish holiday. So Antiochus says, a Jewish holiday. Which one? Pesach, Sukkot, which Jewish holiday? Rosh Hashanah. And he said, no, I don't know exactly, but I know whatever day you're going to die is going to be a Jewish holiday. Right? So that's the joke that it goes, right? They say this about everybody, and that's really the idea behind every single Jewish holiday is, as they say, right? How do you sum up all Jewish holidays? Anybody knows? Go for it. Anybody?
They tried to kill us. We won. Let's eat.
Yeah, very good. Yep. They tried to kill us. We won. Let's eat. And so that's the idea. Is that that's how we look at it. They try to kill us, we won, let's eat. Now let's get to Hanukkah. Does anybody here know what Hanukkah actually celebrates? Okay, so that's the general idea. We know they tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. But what does Hanukkah actually celebrate? Does anybody know?
The cleaning up of...
Sorry.
Go for it.
Go ahead, Anne.
The Maccabees.
The miracle of the Maccabees. So the Maccabees vanquishing the enemy, the Syrian Greeks. Yes?
That's a military victory, yes.
A military victory. So that is that's your final answer.
Yes.
I was thinking it's actually cleaning out the temple because it was a disaster and the idolatry was in there. So it actually resets the temple.
Very good. So you're saying it's the dedication of the temple. It's actually one of the names of Hanukkah. Hanukkah means rededication. So you're saying it's rededicating the temple. Any other miracles? So we have the miracle of rededicating the temple. We have the miracle of the war. Any other?
And the oil in the holy temple, and there was enough oil for just one day, and it burned miraculously it burned for 8.
Very
but
good.
We also hear that that's a Bubba Meiser sometimes.
Well, you won't hear that from me.
Okay.
Fair enough, right? Right. So we have the miracle of the war, miracle of rededicating the temple, miracle of oil that was supposed to last for one day, lasts for 8 days. There's one more miracle. Well, one of those was not a miracle, but there's one more miracle that we are omitting. Maybe Shelley alluded to it, but nobody said it clearly. There's one more miracle that's missing over here, a miracle that happened on Hanukkah. So again, you have the miracle of the war, miracle of the oil lasting for 8 days, rededicating the temple. Any others?
Judy spearing through the captain.
That's a detail of the war. Any other miracles? I'll give you a hint. It's a miracle with the oil. Nobody. All right, it's interesting. A lot of people miss it. So the other miracle that happened on Hanukkah is the fact that they actually found a jug of oil. That's one of the miracles. Remember, it wasn't that they couldn't find oil. What do you mean there was no oil? Everybody has oil. You go to Walmart. I mean, I don't think there was a supply chain shortage going on over there. Everybody had oil. They didn't have those issues. The issue was there was no pure oil. They came into the temple. The Greeks had defiled all of the oil. They cracked open all the seals, and they were not pure. You read on your bottle of oil, it says, don't eat if seal is broken. So they did not want to use in the temple impure oil. If the Greeks touched it, it became impure. So other miracle of Hanukkah is just the fact that they even found that jug of oil. That itself is a miracle. Okay. So the Talmud comes and it asks, what is actually the miracle of Hanukkah? What is the miracle of Hanukkah for which we celebrate Hanukkah? We have all these options of miracles. There's the miracle of the war, there's the miracle of finding the oil, and there's the miracle of the oil lasting for 8 days. Which one of those is the actual Hanukkah established for? Now, just an interesting tidbit. It's interesting that actually the laws of Hanukkah are not mentioned in the Mishnah and are mostly mentioned in the Talmud. For those who know a little bit about the oral Jewish tradition, there's different opinions why it's not mentioned in the Mishnah, but some people say because the Hashmonaim, who were Kohanim, the Maccabees, they were Kohanim, and they kind of took over being the kings of Israel after they won the wars, whereas the author of the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda, was from the house of King David, and they were supposed to be the kings. And so they didn't really like the fact that, the Hashmonaim took over as kings. That's just one opinion. There's many opinions as to why, but regardless, it's interesting. There is no tractate called the Tractate of Hanukkah. There is a tractate for the Megillah of Purim, but there is no tractate for the holiday of Hanukkah because it's not in the Mishnah. However, in the Talmudic section of Shabbat, there it discusses some of the laws of Shabbos because it talks about lighting candles, so it gets into the lighting of the menorah. I just want to mention one other thing. We know for Purim, we get the story of Purim from the Megillah. Where do we get the story of Hanukkah from? Did anybody ever think about this? Where do we get the story of Hanukkah from? Where do we know it from? Like, it mentions in the prayers a little bit about it, but we have all these details about the story of Hanukkah. Where are we actually pulling it from? It's not written in any of the 24 books. So where is it coming from? Anybody knows? Any thoughts? Historical? What historical documents do we use to tell us the story of Hanukkah? So it's actually interesting. So I'll answer the question. It's actually interesting. The most historical document in Jewish sources is a book called Megillas Antiochus. So there was a Megillah written. It was not incorporated in the books of the Torah, but it is called Megillas Antiochus. Antiochus, of course, being the king. Other people call it Megillas Chanukah or Megillat Beit Hashmonaim, Megillat Yevanim. But regardless, this Megillah is the most quoted amongst the Jewish sages as the most authoritative story of the Hanukkah. What's interesting is a lot of the details that we consider part of the story of Hanukkah actually don't appear in there, and some ideas in that story seem to contradict some of the stories we're told as kids. It's just a very interesting thing. There are other sources for the story of Hanukkah, one of them being Josephus.
Josephus. Oh.
Yes, very good, Keturah. Yes, Josephus has some of the writings on the story of Hanukkah. There is some discrepancies between the two, between Megillas Antiochus and Josephus, but not entirely. And it's a very, very interesting thing. Some communities actually have the custom to read the Megillah of Antiochus. There's also a book called the Book of Maccabees, and in Jewish sources, that's considered not a Jewish source. And from a historical accuracy point in Jewish circles, we will not trust it if it contradicts one of our books. Anyways, that being said, so the story of Hanukkah, why did they establish the holiday of Hanukkah? So let's take a look over here. The Talmud asks this very question. Why did they establish the holiday of Hanukkah? And so the Talmud answers, it says like this. What is Hanukkah, the Talmud asks? In other words, what is the primary miracle which Hanukkah commemorates? The Talmud answers, and we're not going to read the actual Talmud, that the Hanukkah was established to commemorate the miracle of the oil. They found one jug of oil with the seal of the high priest, and it had only enough to last for 1 day, but miraculously it lasted for 8 days. So in other words, the main miracle is the two miracles of the oil, the finding it and the lasting for 8 days. The miracle of the war alone would have not been enough to establish a holiday. And when you think about it, it's kind of true. We've had many miraculous conquests in Jewish history. Not all of them became holidays, right? the fact that the menorah lasted for 8 days afterwards is kind of a culmination of that war. Like, was a miraculous war enough? And then God sends us this beloved sign to us that he's going to have this oil last for 8 days. That's kind of why they established it as a holiday. In fact, it took them a year to decide if they even wanted to make it a holiday, but just an interesting point. So anyways, he says, inasmuch as the holiday commemorates the miracle of oil, the lesson with which we learn from the holiday should be derived from the Hanukkah lights as well. In other words, a lot of people like to learn the lessons of Hanukkah from the miraculous conquest, stand up for what you believe in. But we also have to learn a lesson from the oil, right? So a lot of times we say, the menorah is a sign of religious freedom, because that's what the Maccabees were fighting for. And that's true. But we also have to find a lesson within the oil itself, because that's really what established the holiday. I just want to point out as an aside, the Rabbi points out in another place that we can say that maybe the physical celebrations on Hanukkah were established for the physical miracle, which would be the war. So eating latkes and donuts and having big meals, that's a celebration of the war miracle. And the more spiritual miracle, which is the menorah, for that we have the saying of the recitation of the Hallel and the lighting of the candles. So the spiritual part of the miracle makes the spiritual part of the holiday. Just an interesting thing, either way. So the Rebbe says over here that we need to find a lesson in the oil itself. So let's take a look. So the Rebbe says, if we want to find a lesson in oil itself, we have to break down what is a candle, what is light. So light, the function of a candle, doesn't create anything new. It merely illuminates and enlightens that which already exists. It gives us the ability to see and determine whether the matters in our close proximity are dangerous or whether they are desirable. Is the gaping hole a door which leads to expanses of the world, or a pit which brings one to the world's lowest depths? Is it white or black, and so on and so forth? In other words, a candle or light does not create anything new. A candle or light, all a candle or light can do is illuminate what is already there. Right? When you think about it, you walk into a room, whether the light is on or off, all of those items are in that room already. But the benefit of light is that it enables you to use and it illuminates everything that is around you. Okay? So what does this have to do with the war of the Jewish people and the Greeks? What does this have to do with a lesson of Hanukkah? So let's take a look. Very interesting. This is like this. How does this relate to the war of the Jews on the Greeks against the Jews? On a deeper level, light represents wisdom because it enlightens the person. As the verse says, the fool goes in the dark. So King Solomon says, a fool goes in the dark, while the wise man's eyes are in his head. So what does King Solomon mean that a fool goes in the dark and a wise man's eyes are in his head? What does being foolish have to do with dark? And the answer is that just as physically, when you have light, it enables you to interact with the world around you in the right way. Wisdom is the same thing. If you have wisdom, you will know how to act properly and not do foolish things. A fool is someone who does not have the wisdom to know what to say and what not to say, right? And we meet these people all the time, and they don't think too far ahead. We call them fools, and they don't interact very well with the world around them, and they don't have too many friends except for people like them. Some people might say they don't have a filter, whatever it is. So that's what. So thinking, intellect, our mind is like the light of a candle. It enables us to interact with the world around us. It gives us the ability to see and evaluate the world around us, to know what we should be doing and what we shouldn't be doing. So what we have over here so far is an understanding that light is wisdom. And therefore, the message of Hanukkah in light has to be, there's a message about wisdom. There's a message about wisdom over there. And fascinatingly enough, this is actually the message of Hanukkah. In other words, the battle between the Greeks and the Jews during Hanukkah was actually about this very thing. In other words, just as the miracle of Hanukkah eventually culminates in the lighting of a menorah, and light represents wisdom, actually the battle that was had between the Jews and the Greeks the entire time was all about wisdom. That's what we're going to see today. A lot of people think it was just about religion. They didn't like their religion, but it's actually not so much that. It's a totally different way of looking at wisdom. And when we can understand the different way of looking at wisdom, then we can have a powerful lesson in our lives in what is the right wisdom in our life to have and what is not the right wisdom to have. So again, to summarize, we've established today there were a couple miracles that made Hanukkah. One of them is the battle, and the other one is about the oil and the lighting of the menorah for 8 days. The main holiday of Hanukkah is established for the lighting of the menorah, the light. And so we have to find a lesson in light itself. We've discussed till now how light represents intellect, wisdom, because just as light illuminates the world around you, wisdom illuminates the world around you. And the lesson of Hanukkah will be in wisdom. And actually the battle between the Greeks and the Jewish people was all about wisdom. So let's take a look over here. Any questions before I move further? I don't think I've said much. I've just established. I haven't really given much much to discuss yet because we haven't gotten into the teeth of it. But good evening to everybody. I see Shani made it on. Nice to see you. And Shelly, you made it on the first try, which is good. Okay, so let's take a look over here. Very, very interesting. People don't realize, a lot of people don't even think, what were the Greeks going for? We think they were the classic enemies of the Jews, but they actually were not. They were not our classic enemies. When you think of it, they weren't necessarily just trying to destroy us. So let's take a look over here. Why were the two nations fighting? Now, the Greeks were a very intellectually advanced nation. They are well known in history to have been heavily engaged in the pursuit of wisdom. The Jews were also a very intellectually minded nation, constantly in the pursuit of wisdom, as the verse states, for this is your wisdom and understanding in the eyes of the nations. That being the case, that both nations, Jews and Greeks, highly treasured the pursuit of wisdom, why do they clash to the extent that they waged a full-out war? In other words, if you think of it, a lot of times you fight other societies because they're so different from yours. But the Greeks were known to have great philosophers, Aristotle and Socrates, and I think Plato, and a bunch of others. They were very much into wisdom. So what issue did they have with us? So we did things a little bit different, but if our general lifestyle was thinking, we should seemingly be able to get along. Deep people of the book, we should seemingly be people that they would like to hang out with. And but when you think about, but it's also interesting that although the Greeks were very much into wisdom, they also were very much into physicality. So that's an interesting thing which we're going to point out. In other words, although the Greeks were very much into wisdom, they were very much into the physical body. Somebody wrote here, different value systems. Yes, they were very much, although they were very much into wisdom, very much into the body. For example, the Olympics come from the Greeks, from their god Olympia. I think it was called Olympus, I forget exactly. Next to the temple, they built
Mount Olympus.
Olympus, yes. Thank you.
Mount Olympus.
Thank you, Mount Olympus. Yes, a mountain? Okay. Next to the temple, they built a track where people would run and show off physical feats. It's also, by the way, one of the things, they didn't ban all commandments. One of the commandments they banned was circumcision, because they believed it was taking away from the beauty of the body. Many Jews who wanted to act like Greeks actually had a reverse circumcision. Sounds pretty bad. They had a reverse circumcision because they wanted to be, that's another reason they banned the Shabbat. They said, what's this, taking off a day, for laziness, for doing nothing? But at some point, they also banned the study of Torah, which seems a little bit strange. So why would they ban the study of Torah? See, if they didn't ban everything, why would they ban the study of Torah? And the answer is going to be that actually general intellect, and Torah is very different. So not only do they act differently, but actually our wisdom and their wisdom is very different in a very fundamental level. Let's take a look here for something very fascinating that the Midrash tells us. So the Midrash says something, when you think about it, it's wild. So it sounds like this. The Midrash makes the following statement. If someone tells you that there's wisdom amongst the nations, believe him. If he says there is Torah among the nations, don't believe him. So again, it's saying wisdom and Torah are not the same thing, right? Generally, we like to say, oh, we're the people of the book, right? So it sounds like Torah is another type of wisdom, but actually Torah is not just another type of wisdom, as you see clearly here in the Medrash. The Medrash is saying everybody can have wisdom. Torah is unique. As explained in Hasidism, a name is very significant. A lot can be learned from the distinction of names wisdom versus Torah. So what is the difference? What is the difference between wisdom and Torah? Okay. So the wisdom refers purely to the intellectual pursuit. Wisdom is the ability to evaluate any given matter, but it does not compel the individual to implement the results. You may know that something is good and desirable, or that something is evil and detestable, but it has nothing to do with your choices. You can choose not to act according to your intellectual conclusions. In other words, although wisdom does illuminate the world around us and tell us what should be the good things and what not the good things, but that alone does not compel us to act. You know, I said earlier, some people are foolish because they're foolish, but some people are foolish because they have no filter. What does that mean? That means they may have the wisdom to know what's wrong, but yet they go ahead and they make the wrong decision. A great example of this is there's a lot of people in the medical field, a lot of doctors who really know better than us what an unhealthy lifestyle leads to, or smoking, you know, or nurses, and yet some of them nevertheless do many of those things, because wisdom and action are not necessarily related. They can be, but they don't have to be. A person can be very smart and act totally the opposite, and it does not take away from them being a smart person, right? In other words, in the world, if you're smart, you don't have to be the best person. I mean, maybe nobody will like you, but it doesn't take away from your wisdom. But Torah, on the other hand, is different. Let's read it here. Torah means guide. Torah actually comes from the word hora'ah. Torah, hora'ah. Hora'ah means lesson. It not only illuminates and enlightens your life, giving you the ability to discern right from wrong, it also influences your life choices, causing you to conduct yourself according to your intellectual conclusions. I'm not going to read a little bit further text. You can read it yourself if you want, but Torah essentially, although we call ourselves people of the book, it's not about reading a book. It's about giving a life lesson, a way to live our lives. Yes, as he points out there, it's possible someone can also learn Torah in a way that it's not meant to be a life lesson, but that's not what the essence of Torah is. Torah is about giving you a life lesson. It's not a book of fascinating stories in which we can learn intellectual concepts. You know, the Talmud is not just collections of fascinating logical novelty ideas that you can twist your mind like a pretzel about. It's more about, it's about hora'ah. Torah is about a lesson. That's what it means. If somebody tells you there's wisdom in the world, yes, there's wisdom in the world. There can be wisdom in the world. People can be very smart and wise. But if someone tells you there's Torah, Torah is a unique type of intellectual study. What does that mean? It's not an intellectual study that is purely intellectual, but it's an intellectual study that has to have an actual application in your life. And that's the difference between wisdom and Torah. Wisdom does not have to have a practical application in your life. It can if you so choose. But Torah study must have a practical application in your life. Otherwise, it's not really Torah. And we're going to bring a powerful example of this. The powerful example you may have read in the text over there. Ignore what you read over there if you did read it, but anybody here knows the famous reason why was the Holy Temple destroyed? Why was the Holy Temple destroyed? Any takers?
People started really idolizing other things.
Okay. Any others? It's a famous reason. Why was the temple destroyed? We tell our kids all the time. There was a story behind it too. Kamsa and Bar Kamsa.
Yeah, I was going to say Kamsa, Bar Kamsa, and the wedding, and they didn't treat each other decently and humiliated one of the guys. And
Very good. So the simple reason for the destruction of the temple, we all know, is they did not treat each other nicely. They had what was called sinat chinam, senseless hatred. And that's why we always say we need to have senseless love. And that's the way we'll bring back the temple. But that's actually only the reason the Talmud says why the second temple was destroyed. What is the reason that the first temple was destroyed? What's the overriding sin? Okay, in other words, obviously they had a lot of sins, but there's, like the straw that breaks the camel's back. What's the sin that really got God angry? And the Talmud, based on a verse in Jeremiah, says a very fascinating answer. The Talmud says the reason why the first temple was destroyed is because they did not make a blessing on the Torah before they studied it. Okay, so let me read this. Let's read the text inside.
Wow.
As of here, the matter remained a mystery. Okay, the Lord said, "It is because they have forsaken my Torah, which I said before them, and have not hearkened to my voice." Now, it would appear that not hearkened to my voice. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda said that Rav said the expression "not walk by it" means they did not first recite a blessing of the Torah. So this is the Talmud explaining when Jeremiah says that the temple was destroyed because they've forsaken my Torah. The rabbis explained it doesn't mean they didn't study the Torah, because everybody studied the Torah back then. What it means is they did not recite the blessing before studying the Torah, which when you think about it is pretty crazy. And as the famous rabbi, the Bach, or Rabbi Circumcision, writes, this is very perplexing. Why were they meted such a severe punishment for the seemingly minor transgression of failing to recite the blessing of Torah study, right? Why should failing to recite a blessing before Torah study cause the temple to be destroyed, right? So if I were to say, for example, the temple is destroyed because they didn't make a blessing before they shook the lulav and etrog. I'll say, what do you mean? But they at least they did the mitzvah. They shook the lulav and etrog. Do you know how many Jews today don't shake lulav and etrog, right? How could that be the reason the temple is going to be destroyed? Because they didn't make the blessing. So same question here. Why are we saying that the temple was destroyed because they did not make a blessing before? And the answer is, and which we've been leading to it, is if you don't make a blessing before the Torah, then you could be totally missing the point of Torah. You could be totally missing what Torah really is. If you're not making a blessing before you study Torah, what does a blessing before studying Torah mean? Blessing before studying Torah means I understand this is not just any wisdom, this is God's wisdom. If you take God out of it and it becomes just a wisdom, then it's not Torah study anymore. So it's not like lulav and etrog where you shake the lulav and etrog. I can say, well, who else shakes a palm frond and a citron? Obviously, you're doing a mitzvah, right? But when it comes to Torah study, you can say, well, you're studying it because it's a beautiful intellectual pursuit. And therefore, when they were not saying the blessing, what it meant was they were not really studying Torah. They were studying just a general wisdom that happened to be called the Torah. Let's take a look over here. What he explained.
Rabbi, what would that blessing be? Which blessing is it?
Great question. And we say it every morning in the morning blessings. Let me get it for the prayer book. But, it's the same blessing when people are called up to the Torah. When people are called up to the Torah, they say the blessing over the Torah. We say that same
Like
blessing.
Divrei La'asot Torah. Something.
Yeah. We have the blessing in the beginning, page 8 in the blue sitter, but who has commanded us on the words of Torah, and then we quote some verses of Torah, and then we say the Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim. It's in there too. So it's a whole section. It's actually a long run section. Basically, the reason is we say the Yivarechecha over there. When you say the blessing, you have to actually study something. So we first say the blessing and then we study something. So it's all over there. It's the last section of the morning blessings in the prayer book. But good question. We don't want to destroy the temple again. So we want to make sure I make the blessings in the morning. So actually, that's why it's questionable. If you didn't say the blessing on Torah study, am I allowed to teach it to you now? But maybe you're just listening, you're not saying it. It's okay. Anyway, either way. So the story is, I'm sharing the screen. Okay, it seems that the real point is that we should be studying Torah to unite our souls with the spirituality and the holiness of Torah's source. God gave us the Torah as an eternal gift so that our souls and our bodies, our 248 limbs and 365 sinews, should cleave to the 248 mitzvahs and 365 prohibitions. But at that point, they transgressed this rule. They studied Torah for their own mundane pleasures, to understand the laws for the sake of their business practices, or to demonstrate their brilliance. They didn't intend to cleave to the Torah's holiness and spirituality and to bring the divine presence into this world. And it's very interesting because we all know we are called people of the book. And a lot of people like to point how we've been so intellectual over all the years. And what we're presenting here today is really a very important point, that although it is really great that we were people of the book and that we always studied, it's important to always remember that Jewish study is not about study alone. And when we strip away the lifestyle that comes with it, then it's not Torah anymore. And actually, as our sages say elsewhere, it's kind of could be like a medicine. Torah can be like a medicine. If you put, if a medicine is put in the right place, it does wonders. And when it's put in the wrong place, it can actually harm you, right? So somebody's sick, they take a certain medication, they get better, but somebody's healthy, takes a medication, it becomes poison for them. And so a similar idea over here, right? So let's say a diabetic who takes insulin, it's great for them, right? But somebody who's healthy takes insulin, it's probably not a good idea, right? I'm going to guess that. I'm not sure. I have to ask the pharmacist over here. But I'm going to guess yes. Yeah, the doctor, yeah. I'm just guessing. It's probably not healthy. So it says the Torah is the same thing. When used in the proper way, it's healing. But when used in the wrong way, it's a poison. And that's really what Torah is about. Is we always have to remember, it's beautiful that we're people of the book. It's beautiful. We've been so intellectual throughout all the years, and we can point to our great intellectual achievements. But when we strip away the action that comes with it, then it loses the Torah. And this actually explains a very, very fascinating thing that the Rebbe likes to point out. There's a famous prayer that we say during the prayers and during the benching during the holiday of Hanukkah. Does anybody know what that prayer is called? There's also songs about it. Anybody? What's the prayer we add on Hanukkah? Huh? Al Hanisim.
Shechianu.
Very good. Al Hanisim. Al Hanisim. Yeah. Shechianu is every holiday. Al Hanisim. We say a prayer for the miracles that God did for us. And in that prayer, we mention in short the miracles. And one of the miracles it says over there, it says like this. I'll read to you the English. In the days of Matasio, the son of the Yochanan the high priest, the Hasmonean and his sons, when the wicked Hellenic government rose up against your people, Israel, to make them forget your Torah and violate the decrees of your will. But you and your abounding mercy stood by them in their time of distress, and it continues and tells the miracle. What's interesting is it doesn't say they made them forget the Torah and violate the mitzvos. It says, interesting, it says they made them forget your Torah and they made them violate the decrees of your will. And the Rebbe points out that's exactly what the Greeks' issue was. The Greeks had no issue with Torah study as an intellectual pursuit, but they didn't want it to be your Torah. They didn't want it to be God's Torah. They wanted to take the intellectual part and separate it from the godly part. They wanted to say, you want to do a mitzvah, you want to circumcise because you think it's healthy, okay, whatever. You want to keep Shabbos because it helps you work the rest of the week, do it. But don't do it because God is telling you some irrational, some supernal, some spiritual ideas. They said, you do everything based on what you understand, what makes sense, and what's intellectual. But once the God thing came into it, they couldn't handle it. And that's why it says, they didn't try to make us forget Torah. They want us to forget your Torah, Torah Techa, to forget God's Torah. And so this is really the crux of the issue between the Jewish people and the Greeks, is that the Greeks had wisdom, but our wisdom and their wisdom is not the same. Because our wisdom, our Torah, is not just about a wisdom and intellectual study, but it's about a study that leads to action. So let's take a look over here. Let's see how the Rebbe reads this out over here. Okay. The Torah of Truth states that there is wisdom among the nations to the extent that those wisdoms are to be consulted in certain matters, such as medical advice. The Torah recognizes the expertise of the non-Jewish physician. It's not saying you can't have a Jewish physician, but saying even if they're not Jewish, so let's say a non-Jewish physician says, you have to violate the Shabbos for this person, we would listen to that doctor, right? So what is that telling us is that Torah itself trusts the wisdom of the world. Okay. The Torah also recognizes the field of astronomy. Maimonides writes that some of the calculations for the Jewish calendar were taken from non-Jewish sources, although he seems to indicate that the wisdom of the Gentiles itself is a source in Torah. Regardless, what he's saying is wisdom itself, we believe wisdom exists. Nonetheless, their knowledge and wisdom had no impact on their behavior. He's talking specifically about the Greeks. Despite their recognition of right and wrong, they retained the ability to behave in the opposite manner, being that their wisdom was not linked to their behavior. There is even the possibility of being smart to do evil, i.e., even as the Torah recognizes that they are wise, they utilize their wisdom to commit evil. A lack of wisdom is not a positive thing, but what is even worse is to use one intellect to commit evil. So what he's saying is that they are wise, but their being wise did not necessarily have an effect on their behavior. And there's actually stories that bring this out. And here's a story, famous story. There's a well-known story about Aristotle, one of the greatest Greek philosophers, who is often dubbed Chacham, wise man in Jewish sources. And Maimonides extols his wisdom on several occasions. So Maimonides talks about Aristotle like a brilliant person. He was once caught in a immoral act, a sexual immoral act. And when asked, how could such a wise man teacher to so many students do such a loathsome act? He responded, no, I'm not Aristotle. In other words, the Aristotle that you talk of is the Aristotle, the professor in college. That's the great Aristotle. No, I'm just Aristotle. No, I'm just, I'm a human being. That's the idea. When he's in the act of pursuing wisdom, he's Aristotle. But when it came to his behavior, he was no longer Aristotle because his wisdom was not associated with his behavior to begin with. It's like, it's like they once asked another immoral person who was very wise. They said, why does your personal life contradict what you teach? And he said, look, when I teach you the geometry, are you expecting me to become a triangle? He says, no. So I teach you. So that's why I teach you. And this is how I act. No, my high, I could be different. What's the big deal? Now we bring another example from Socrates. Similarly, another famous Greek philosopher named Socrates, who is quoted as having said, but love truth above all, is known to have lived in a wild manner, especially with regards to immoral marital life. Again, this is Jewish sources. You look today on Wikipedia, some opinions say yes, some opinions say no, but regardless, Jewish sources say that's how he acted. And it was a regular component of his behavior, unlike Aristotle, who was merely caught once. They didn't even bother asking Socrates about such matters. He always acted like that because his wisdom made no impact on his behavior. However, among the Jewish people, there is a Torah, a guide, the pursuit of intellect, which eliminates the past of right and wrong, obligate him to behave accordingly. So when it comes to Judaism, we all know a spiritual leader, we will not study Torah from somebody who does not live the life. If they live a sinful life, although they can be very wise, you will not find their books in the study halls. That's why sometimes people ask me about certain great scholars or people who study a lot of Torah but didn't necessarily live a Torah life. We wouldn't take them into the study hall because Torah is not just about the wisdom. You can have a very smart person studying Torah. If they didn't live the life, then it's not necessarily really Torah. If they did not follow its precepts, if they did not believe in its divinity, as great and as wise and as helpful as their ideas may be, they are not something that we want to study because, again, Torah is not just an intellectual pursuit, but it actually has to have an action that goes along with it. And here's just a great statement from our sages in the Talmud. Rabbi Yochanan said as follows: what is the meaning of that which is written? For the priest's lips should keep knowledge, and they should seek Torah in his mouth, for he is a messenger, malach of the Lord of hosts. This verse teaches, if the teacher is similar to an angel, malach of the Lord, then seek Torah from his mouth. But if not, do not seek Torah from his mouth. And so what it's saying is that a teacher of Torah has to live a very honorable life. You cannot just be an anybody and say that everybody should listen to you. All right, so what I've presented here is that Jewish intellect, i.e. Torah, is very, very different than general wisdom and general pursuit. And that is why when I asked earlier in the class, what did the Greeks have with the Jews? Seemingly, they were both very intellectual societies. And as someone pointed out, their values are very different because our wisdom is also very different. Our wisdom is very much focused on the action. Everybody knows the famous, or maybe you don't know, but there's a statement in Pirkei Avot, Ethics of Our Fathers. It says, what do you call someone who has a lot of wisdom but not a lot of good deeds? And so, it says they're like a tree that doesn't have a lot of roots, but it has a lot of fruits, a lot of leaves, so wind comes and blows it down. Yeah, vice versa. Somebody has a lot of good deeds, a lot of roots, not so much wisdom, not so many fruits, but they won't be blown down. And so that's just a general outlook is that Torah without the actions is not really Torah. In other words, it's not just not doing Torah. In other words, it's not that we can separate them. That's really what I'm getting to. You can say, well, this person is a great scholar, but the mitzvahs they're not so good in. No, if they don't follow along with the mitzvahs, they don't follow along with the lifestyle, their Torah is not even really Torah. Because Torah is not just a wisdom, Torah is a way of life. Why is it? Because that's how we look at it. Let's read. Let's read over here. So where does the differentiation between the Jewish people and the Greeks stem from? Let's read over here, third paragraph. In the Jewish approach, action is primary goal. The first and foremost priority is to behave according to the dictates of the Torah mitzvos. That is why we study, to know which deeds to embrace and which to avoid. The pursuit of knowledge is only a means to them to be practically applied to our lives. Which I want to point out, even areas of Torah that don't seem practical. So, for example, I mentioned in a class before, there's some mitzvahs in the Torah maybe never happened. Nevertheless, even when we study things that don't seem practical in our lives, or maybe we're studying the offerings in the temple that don't exist today, even when we're studying the intellectual part of the Torah, we're always supposed to find a lesson in our life. If you come to Chabad, you know, it's what we always do. But in most areas, at some point, you have to take what you learn, and it has to have an effect on how you live your life. Torah should never be just entirely intellectual. Okay? Let's move forward. It is therefore impossible for a Jew to use his wisdom to commit evil, because the first foundation is that one must behave according to Torah's dictates, and that the entire existence of intellect is only here to serve the purpose of differentiating between good and bad. Such wisdom cannot be perverted into an evil one, being that the entire goal of the wisdom is solely to influence his behavior for the better. So in other words, obviously you can study Torah not in the proper way, but if you were to study Torah in the right way, it cannot serve a bad purpose, because the purpose of Torah is to illuminate how to live your life. As we said earlier, the word Torah means a lesson in our life. Now, why is it, where does it stem from that the wisdom of the Torah cannot lead us in a bad path, and that the wisdom of the Torah has to come into action? And this stems from something that a lot of people don't realize just how powerful it is, and this is the concept of monotheism. We all know the belief in one God is a powerful one and an important one. But why is it so important to believe in one God? If I believe in God, it's a good thing. Multiple gods is great too. And the answer is very interesting, is that the belief in one God means that there's one overriding and transcendent principle above all, and that is God. That's what belief in one God means. When we say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, here is the Lord our God, the Lord is one. What that is telling us is that there's one principle in life, and one principle in life. There's not multiple things in our life. There's one thing in our life, and it's all about God. So if there's Torah, if there's wisdom, it's about serving God. If there's mitzvahs, it's about serving God. There aren't different important things. Okay, our life is not split into important things. A lot of people's lives are split. There's family, and there's work, and there's self-care, whatever. Everybody has different things that they consider great, their own, we might call them gods. In Judaism, all of those things boil down to one thing, which is God, one God. Family is about God, and work is about God, and self-care is about God. Everything is about God. And so therefore, you're not going to be led wrong following one versus the other. You will not get lost in intellect and lose sight of the action, because the whole reason you got involved in the intellect is because of God. And that same God is the same God that told you to make sure you follow action. So again, when we bring God, the overriding principle, into all aspects of our life, that will make sure we will do all of them properly. So some people get lost in their work. If you bring God into your work, then you'll recognize, why am I doing this work? Am I doing it just to make a lot of money? No, probably not. I'm doing it to serve God. Well, if serving God also means I have to be there for my family, then I'm going to make sure that I have the time for my family. Okay, a lot of times we have religious people who also become workaholics, myself included sometimes, because we lose sight of why we're really doing it. And this is really a lifelong work, to bring monotheism, to bring one God into our life. It's very, very hard. Many of us have multiple gods in our life. It could be money, it could be work, it could be prestige, it could be honor. We can call them all gods. It's a lifelong work, this monotheism. There's a reason we say the Shema so many times. The Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, once wrote in the Tanya in one place. He says, you have people, you get there, you say the Shema, here is the Lord our God, Lord is one, right? All with devotion. He says, then the moment they move their eyes, the whole world reappears at them. It's like the whole godliness disappears, poof, and the world comes back at them. They uncover their eyes and it's all back. So that's kind of how we are. Is we have multiple gods in our life, but real Judaism and what we strive for is to have that one God, and that's the Jewish approach. And that's why even when we study Torah, there was a focus on action, because intellect itself cannot be a God. Why? Because it's something greater than intellect. The Greeks, though, the Rebbe says, had multiple gods. So there's a God of intellect, and there's a God of action, and they even had immoral gods. They had the God of this, and the God of food, and the God of this. They have multiple gods, so there's no overriding principle. So somebody can be very smart and act immoral. One day he's living with the God of intellect, the next day he's living with the God of immorality, and it's a great life. They don't have to be connected. If there's not one overriding principle, they're not connected. You can be very wise and very smart. It doesn't change how you act. But the Jewish approach, this is the power of monotheism, believing in one God. There's something greater than everything else. And that's actually what the Yiddish word, the Rebbe says, the Yiddish word for God is Eibishter. What does Eibishter mean? Eibishter. Oib, from the Yiddish word oib, oibishter. Eibishter, means oib, it means above, something beyond, transcendent. That's what God is. God is something that's above, who transcends everything. That's really what a belief in one God is about, is that there's one thing that transcends everything else, and nothing else is greater than God. Intellect is not greater than God, right? So a lot of times we, with our little puny minds, decide that we think that what God wants us to do is wrong, because based on my mind, I figured out that what God should really want me to do would be to do this. And we have to have the humility to say there's something that is greater than my mind, and that's God. We have to have that humility to recognize the Eibush there, because our minds, when we worship intellect, they can drive us crazy and lead us to many, many different paths. Our minds are wonderful. They can convince you of anything. As we quoted the quote earlier, the mind, you can use wisdom and intellect to lead a terrible life. You can use the mind and explain anything away. And we have to have the humility to say, this is my mind and this is my thoughts, but I will submit myself to God. So let's take a look here at the actual text of what I just explained. The Jewish approach stems from another issue. The Jewish approach, that the most important element is the resulting action, doesn't stem from an intellectual conviction. In other words, you might say, the reason why Judaism realizes that we have to have action is because intellect tells us learning without action doesn't really work. No, it stems from a dedication to God, whom we recognize to transcend all other existences, as he is commonly called in Yiddish, the Eibishter, the one above. He transcends anything and everything. If we are to declare as intellect the greatest of all creations, God will remain higher than it. The entire world, God is higher than it. The entire universe and everything it contains, God is still higher. Right? A lot of people today like to say, the universe is so vast and so wide, and we barely understand any part of it. You're right. And you know what's greater than all of that is God. So the world is vast. We don't understand, but we still have God who's greater than all of it, and he tells us what we have to do. Don't get lost in this big Milky Way or all the Milky Ways or whatever, and say, therefore, I don't have to do anything because I'm a little speck of dust. God is greater than all the universe, than all the planets, and all this and all that, and he tells us what to do. We listen. With that in mind, behavior is a priority and foundation in our approach simply because God determined it to be so. With that foundation, we can proceed to pursue knowledge and determine right from wrong, and so on and so forth. And this foundation should influence all study, secular pursuits as well, to follow the same path. In other words, not just when we study Torah should we figure out how to better our lives, even when we study secular studies, because God says we have to live an honorable life. And when we study something in secular, business or whatever, we have to figure out how to use that for the good too, because that's what God wants. This wasn't the case among the nations, referring specifically to the Greeks in this case. They too had a concept of godliness, but that was not the first and foremost foundation. It was a result and outgrowth of their own desires. There were therefore many gods among them. Being that there were many wants and desires, the deities and many and varied as well. This is also why their gods are involved in theft, promiscuity, and crime, as told over in their religious mythologies, which the Jews forbidden to study, parenthetically. Their gods are an outgrowth of their own desires and therefore resemble those desires perfectly. This is interesting. The Rebbe is saying, why do their gods do things that we do? Because they're resembling their own desires. They desired something, so they created a god that lives with that desire. Because again, they didn't live with an overriding God, an overriding morality of God that God gives us, but they lived with their own desires, and then they found gods that could fit with their desires. And so with this understanding, we can finally come back to the story of Hanukkah and explain the miracle of Hanukkah and the miracle of light and the miracle of finding the one jug of oil. So let's take a look. That was the war between the Greeks and the Jews. The Greeks definitely valued intellect, but it was in direct contradiction to the Jewish approach to wisdom. The Greeks valued wisdom as an end in itself, one which wasn't specifically associated with a specific mode of behavior. On a practical level, a person was free to behave as he saw fit without taking others into consideration. If another person disturbed him, there was nothing stopping him from freeing himself of the nuisance. Even if he needed to resort to murder, God forbid, that was the basis of the ideological war and the very physical war of the Greeks against the Jews. So in other words, the physical war came about because they also believed, based on their beliefs, that they could force their beliefs on us. It was part of their general belief system. This is the miracle of Hanukkah, that the Hasmoneans overcame the Greeks, were victorious, and found one jug of oil with the seal of the high priest with which to light the menorah. This is an important thing. If they had just lit any random oil and it lasted for 8 days, that would not be a miracle. They had plenty of oil. But the oil of the high priest, which signifies the holiness. The oil is wisdom. It says oil was wisdom because oil floats above everything. And as we said, light is wisdom. This wasn't just any oil, a wisdom which isn't necessarily associated with human behavior, but an oil with the seal of the high priest, which symbolizes the pursuit of wisdom, which is sanctified with the goal of bettering human behavior. This is the meaning of Torah. It doesn't only light up the room to show us what is a door and what is a pit. It influences us to behave according to our intellect and to transform the obstacle into something productive. So in other words, the Torah is not just light that lets us know what is right and what is wrong, but it actually dictates to us and influences us to lead according to that. So that's a very fascinating distinction. In other words, regular wisdom just tells you what's good and bad, what's right and wrong, and you can also play with it. Jewish wisdom not only tells you what's right and wrong, but it also influences you. It gets into your bones, and can't tell you how many people that there's Daf Yomi is one example, but a lot of different studies that are out there that through deciding that they're going to sit every day and study some Torah, how it's had an effect on their day-to-day life. Because Torah study is not just an intellectual pursuit. Today we've gone to a lot of intellectual pursuits too, but it's something that actually changes who we are and how we live. Why? Because it all comes, as we said, sealed with the sanctity of the high priest who was commissioned by God to seal that oil, because we have that understanding of God. And so when we study Torah with blessing over it first, with having God in that Torah study, then the godliness that's in it can influence our lives. The godliness that's in it can reach deep within our soul and change who we are and change our behaviors. It's kind of like if you were to imagine, I don't know, it's let's say you have two ends and you have a wire that connects in the middle. It says that the Zohar says there are 3 knots that are tied to each other. There's the Jewish people, there's God, and there's the Torah. And so we connect to God through the Torah. The Torah is what binds us to God. And so that's really how we look at Torah. Torah is not just any type of study. It's something that connects us to the Torah. And that's what it means. There are these 3 connections: God, the Jewish people, and the Torah. And through the Torah, that is how we connect to God. And so Torah is not an intellectual pursuit, but it is something that's meant to influence our lives. And on that note, I wanted to end off today's class with a video. And this video is a video about a gentleman called Marvin Tokayer. And Marvin Tokayer was a very intellectual rabbi, and also at some point he went to the Far East. The Rabbi sent him on a mission He went to Japan. I think it was Japan. He was a rabbi in Japan for many years. But he had a private audience with the Rebbe, and he brought up a very fascinating question. He said he wanted to ask the Rebbe, he said, what is the real Maimonides? Maimonides wrote two famous books. One book is called the Mishnah Torah, which is a book of Jewish laws. And the other book is the book called The Guide to the Perplexed, a very philosophical book answering philosophical questions. So, and it seems different, which is the real Maimonides? Well, the real Maimonides, please stand up, right? So you want an answer to that question. And the answer will tie in very much with what we said today. So let's take a look at, I'm going to have to stop the share and reshare it because I have to share it properly. Share screen, optimize for video clip, share sound. Okay, so I'm going to share this video.
Spiritual dimension.
How precious and how important in the world was that. Became a family. Everyone else was astonishment.
Rabbi Marvin Tokayer is a prolific writer and speaker and Jewish historian. As a young college student in 1960, he came to see the Rebbe to discuss some of his theological questions.
I was there for a very, very long time. My guess is a couple hours. And I was not looking at the time. There was no tape recorders at that time, no cassettes at that time, and so I don't have a copy of the conversation, but I remember much of the conversation. Remember quite well. Why would I remember it so well? First of all, the eyes. The eyes of the Rebbe were so penetrating and looked right through me. I never experienced that look ever again, either before or after. I had the impression, and many have said this, that the Rebbe had absolutely nothing on his mind except interest in my questions and interest in my personality. That was an amazing opportunity for me and an amazing experience for me. The Rebbe is running the entire movement by himself, is all alone by himself, has a million things on his mind of great importance. I am insignificant. I'm not part of the movement. I never was a chassid, never will be a chassid, dealing with a different subject entirely. I wasn't talking about Lubavitch Hasidism, basically. And yet I felt that there was nothing more important in the world than me, Moshe Tokayer, having this conversation, and everything else was put aside by the Rebbe. I dealt with the question of the prusbul of Hillel, that you cannot lend money on interest. And when historically in the time of Hillel, the economic system could have collapsed, where people wouldn't lend money before the Shemitah year because you may not get it back, or you cannot lend money on interest. And so they arranged something whereby I don't lend money to you, I lend money to the court, I pay to the court, I don't pay to you, and the court reimburses me. So they found a legal fiction, and he was explaining what a legal fiction is, and it's a very, very good system. Every legal system, every system of laws has a legal fiction, and that was necessary at that time. Do not understand it as a violation of the Torah. Hillel did not violate the Torah. Shammai did not violate the Torah. Rashi did not violate the Torah. The Rambam did not violate the Torah. They found a way for the Torah to exist in their times. And we have to find a way for the Torah to exist in that time. It may be easy, it may be difficult, but that is our responsibility, to make Torah understandable and livable in each time and in each generation. That brought me to the question of the Rambam. There are two Rambams. There's the Rambam of the Moreh Nevuchim, the philosopher, of the Guide to the Perplexed, and there's the Rambam of the Mishnah Torah, the Yad HaZachah, which is a summary of the Talmud, a summary of Jewish law. But it seems that the Rambam of the Mishnah Torah is not exactly the same as the Rambam of the Moreh Nevuchim. Who's the real Rambam? The Rebbe said, the Rambam is the Mishnah Torah. That's the way you live day to day. How should I live as a Jew is a question. You can open the Rambam and you can follow him. The question of the Rambam as a philosopher, the Moreh Nevuchim, he said, the Moreh Nevuchim is a guide to the perplexed for today or in his time. In his time, the perplexed were concerned about Aristotle and Neoplatonism and Greek philosophy. He says, who today is concerned about Aristotle? Who says, oh, I have such a question about Aristotle. We don't even know how to spell his name. We don't even read him in Greek. No one even pays any attention to him. Who's concerned about Plato or Neoplatonism? But that was the crucial stumbling block to many thinking Jews and non-Jews. That was the world at that time. It's not the world of today. No one today is concerned about Aristotle. We have our own concerns. And so the Rambam wrote for his generation the Moreh Nevuchim. He wrote for all generations the Mishnah Torah. We're part of the all generations. And he said to me, he says, Moshe, if you would spend your time with the Mishnah Torah rather than the Moreh Nevuchim, it would be much better for you. Better you should memorize the Mishnah Torah and live according to the Mishnah Torah than to memorize the Moreh Nevuchim to have answers for questions that you don't even have. And that was also with a little smile or with a pleasant smile.
So it's a fascinating story and really presents what we've been discussing here today. He obviously, as a historian, reading Maimonides' Guide to Perplexed is a fascinating book. It's got all these philosophical questions, but as the Rebbe said, Judaism is not about just intellectual pursuit. And so instead of spending most of your time figuring out philosophical questions that you don't even have, spend more of your time studying the Jewish law, because that's really what Torah is there for. Maimonides had to write that book in his day for people who had questions. And Baruch Hashem, today there are people who have taken Maimonides and applied it to today for people who have today's questions. But what is our pursuit in Judaism? Is it about having fancy answers for fancy philosophical, intellectual questions we don't know or care about? Is it about knowing sections of the Talmud so we can go to law school? Or is it about living our life in accordance with the life that God wants us in a way that we connect with him? So we say a blessing before we study the Torah. When we say that blessing, we know that when we study the Torah, we're connecting to him. And so as much as we've been known as people of the book, what we should really be known as is people of God. And so that's really the message of today, not just to be people of the book, but people of God's book and people of God. That's what we're supposed to be. We're supposed to be a light to the nations. What does it mean to be a light to the nations? Not just to be a light to the nations, how we take care of the ecosystem. Somebody actually asked me today, Rabbi, Maimonides discusses about how planets have souls. So maybe if Chabad would promote it, then everybody would understand how we have to take care of the planet. Okay, nice idea. But our main focus is that understanding. It's nice that we could be a light to the nations about how we take care. We're good stewards of the world, but ultimately we have to be always bring God into that conversation, because that's really who we are about, is bringing God down here. And that's really where the word tikkun olam comes from, as you read in the Aleinu, to establish this world in the kingdom of God. And that's really what we're trying to do. And so in all our pursuits and everything we try and do, as beautiful as they may be, and as yummy as latkes and donuts may be, and as beautiful as the message of light and religious freedom is, always remember the overriding principle, which is the Eibishter and God. And this was the fight between the Greeks and the Jews, where we have one God, and everything we do is connected to that God. And we never want to take God out of the discourse of our life, no matter how wonderful and brilliant and special other pursuits are. They must have God within that conversation. So, and on that note, when we reach out to others, I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, there's the 7 Noahide laws to bring God even into Gentiles' lives. They don't have to be Jewish, but to bring God into other people's lives. And that's really a powerful thing too. But today's message is mostly about us. It's very easy to get caught up in many areas of Judaism and take God out of it. Hanukkah is a prime example. Many people love the holiday of Hanukkah. Unfortunately, God sometimes leaves the conversation of many of these holidays that we celebrate. And we always have to remember that that was actually the battle of the Greeks and the Jews. If God was not in the conversation, there would have been no miracle, no discussion about the oil. They would have picked up any random oil, impure oil, right? If there's no God, who cares about pure oil, non-impure oil? And so it's all about bringing God into that conversation. So thank you so much for coming. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you have a very, very happy Hanukkah. We hope to see you all on Sunday at the mall. And I'll stop the live stream at Facebook and I'll open up for questions.